So I'm absolutely delighted to be presenting some of my research here today. And more generally, I feel very privileged to be spending 4 months here at SPERI and the politics department at the University of Sheffield. And I have found this already to be, I've been here for about a month and found it to be an enormously warm and welcoming community, but also very importantly, a very intellectually engaging environment. And so it is such a treat to be working here and then to be sharing my research with you. So I'm going to be talking about ignorance today. And I was thinking about this, reflecting a little bit on what I've worked on over the years. And I realized I have a kind of a predilection for focusing on the oddities in international political economy. The things that don't fit, the things that don't quite work, the limits, the problems. In conceptual terms, so my projects have been on ambiguities, exceptions, failures. I don't know what it is, right? It's something, I'm not sure entirely why or what that says about me as a scholar or a person. I'm not going to dig too deeply in there. But today I'm going to focus in on another kind of oddity, which is explore the role of ignorance and varieties of ignorance. So I've had a peripheral interest in the question of ignorance for a number of years. One of my later pieces on ambiguity a number of years ago was part of a special issue in Economy and Society, actually, on the sociology of ignorance. But it's only really recently that I've started wanting to think more systematically about the question of ambiguity, the role of ignorance in political economic theory and practice. Now, partly, of course, that's simply an awareness of the times that we live in, right? We live in a moment now when there are these highly explicit and visible attempts to cultivate a certain kind of ignorance. But it's also been very much driven by what I found, an empirical puzzle I'm going to talk about as I was doing historical research, focusing in particular, as you'll see from the lovely smiling faces there, focusing in particular on the early Thatcher and Reagan governments. So this is a piece of a broader research project that I'm working on. Although I will tell you from the beginning, this is not going to be another book. So in not that, well, I guess 6 years ago now, and within a 12-month period, I managed to produce 2 books and 2 babies. They were twins, so there was, it was not an impossible, but it felt impossible. And so I have decided that, I'm going to take a break from books and babies. And my kids are now 5 and a half, right? So that's over. And so this is instead about a series of themes, and it's going to be translated into a number of articles. But empirically, I'm working around a similar sort of set of questions. Okay, I've been doing a lot of historical work examining the battle against inflation, or the war on inflation of the 1970s and early 1980s. So my research has actually taken me back. Quite a bit of it has been looking at the 70s and incomes policy and so on. Today, though, I'm going to focus more on the very late 70s and the early 80s, and sort of this attempt to understand how neoliberal theory gets translated into practice in those early days, those early efforts. In terms of evidence, what I've been doing, my past work is drawn more on interviews. This time I've gone back and I'm having a lot of fun actually going and spending time in the archive. So what I'm presenting to you is very much still a work in progress. So what I've got so far, I've been obviously going to the archives at Kew, the National Archives here, some of the archives at the LSE, the Hoover Institute in Stanford, which is a gold mine. It has the archives of the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is obviously a major British think tank around this time, as well as those of Friedman and Hayek. And then on the American side, I've been looking at the Library of Congress and the National Archives in Washington. But it's still only part way there. Okay, so I'm going back to Kew. I've got still the presidential libraries, and there's still so much to do. So what I'm presenting is a kind of a snapshot in that process as I'm sorting through my ideas and what I'm finding. So as I've been looking at this moment, this war on inflation, and how these 2 very different ways of tackling the question of inflation, I've been using 3 different analytic lenses. And I'm going to be speaking obviously on the third of them today, but I'll give you a quick sense of what the other work is. And actually, so I gave a talk at Manchester on the first on economic exceptionalism, one at Warwick on quiet failures. And today I'm talking about ignorance. So what I've published on most so far actually is this question of economic exceptionalism. And I've been trying to trace and make sense of not only the role of what we might think of as a kind of emergency exceptionalism, that is the way, there's this whole literature in security studies. I know there's some security people in the room, they're very familiar, right? The idea that we sometimes declare an exception to normal politics, suspend normal democratic practice and rights in the context of a war or a security crisis. I became interested in sort of the economic corollary, right? The ways in which actually governments do this around economic crises all the time. But I've also been interested in tracing the historical evolution of a subtler kind of exceptionalism, a kind of technocratic exceptionalism, right? In which we see the suspension of normal democratic decision-making around key economic policies, particularly around things like monetary policy and so on. So I flag this to you now, because as you'll see when we talk about varieties of ignorance, that is in some ways not unrelated to the attempt in the early 80s, ultimately not successful, but to put in place a kind of technocratic exceptionalism, to find a way around the politics and to find a set of technical solutions to the problems of inflation. Didn't work. I went in actually thinking it would, but that it was going to work. Didn't work, but I will talk about. So I also have a sort of second stream of analysis looking at quiet failures. So if we look at the early 80s, right, and certainly what the received wisdom I got suggested that there had been this very important shift at that moment as we saw neoliberalism take off. And finally, the ideas of Hayek and Friedman, come into reality. Of course, in practice, it was not that simple. There were actually a whole range of failures at that time. Monetarism failed. I'm going to talk about this a bit. Supply-side economics failed. Rational expectations theory failed. But those they never had the kind of political resonance that one would expect of such significant failures. So that is also an interesting puzzle to understand and to unpack that I'm doing, and which is not entirely disconnected to the question of ignorance, as I'll mention throughout this talk. But today I'm going to talk about the third, and for me, the most recent. So you are my guinea pigs, right? I haven't worked this logic through entirely. But I'm going to be talking instead about the third sort of analytic lens, which is the idea of looking at this moment and tracing the varieties of ignorance that we find in play at this time. So why? Why focus on ignorance? Well, like many researchers, my interest came out of a kind of intellectual puzzle, right, an empirical puzzle. I was poking through the archives in the UK and the US, again, particularly from the early 80s, and I was really looking for the sort of power of economic expertise, the power of ideas. But what I found what really struck me was how much was not known, and how much actually people spoke about what they didn't know, and how confused they were about what was going on. Although in many ways what I was finding, as I'll talk about, is these very different kinds of ignorance. There was a kind of ignorance which seemed a lot like wishful thinking or magical thinking, right? A kind of willful ignorance about the fact that maybe these ideas wouldn't work. But there was also genuine, like, what on earth is going on? A kind of cluelessness because things were not working out as according to plan. So I started wanting to just to think this through, to make sense of this, okay? So I developed a series of questions as we do. What kinds of ignorance, in fact, do we find in these efforts to translate, these early efforts to translate neoliberal economic ideas into practice? More generally then, what role or roles does ignorance play? And then what are the stakes? That is, does this matter or not? Is this just something that happens but doesn't have a major impact? Or is this in fact important to our understanding of the nature of political economic theory and practice? So as working on this question, I think for me, I see this as part of my broader interest. So why am I doing this? I think I have this broader interest in my recent work in trying to rethink some of the received wisdom, some of what I got and was taught about neoliberalism and the origins of neoliberalism, which is obviously an interesting question to be thinking about today. My tendency is to go back and think it historically, but again, with an eye to the present. So I think we tend to see neoliberalism in a number of ways that I want to unsettle a bit. I would argue that we see neoliberalism often as too coherent. And there's a whole different number of ways we do this. We describe it as a paradigm, as something that's coherent that then breaks down and gets replaced, maybe, or never, right? But as with Keynesianism. Or we understand it in terms of a logic or blueprint for late capitalism, again, linked to a series of structural logics, reasonably coherent in that context. Or we see it through the lens of more postmodernist, through the lens of governmental rationality. Now, this is a perspective that maybe seems more open, rationalities, but again, it's very easy to start feeling like this is a kind of inevitable logic that is coherent, that is monolithic, and that is hard to resist often. I think in many ways also our conception of neoliberalism is a little too clever, right? That we, and I'm often guilty of this too, right? We focus on the power of expertise, the power of ideas. I'm someone that's interested in ideas. But I think we often misunderstand the power of ideas. We assume that experts are powerful because they manage to do what they want to do, right? That their ideas work and translate into practice. And I think often expertise is powerful, but in completely unexpected ways and unintentional ways, right? That it actually gets a lot of things wrong. That doesn't mean they're not powerful. They have profound effects on the world, but not always the ones that were intended. There are, again, these forms of ignorance, these forms of these failures. And I also think sometimes maybe we conceptualize neoliberalism as too inevitable. And when I say one version of this is the literature on the resilience of neoliberalism. There's a constructivist variance, there's some post-structuralist variance. But again, it's very powerful. It's an analysis like, why is neoliberalism still with us, is their question, right? And it seems neoliberalism seems so plastic. It seems irrefutable, right? It's like the Energizer Bunny. You just keep, you can't stop it. And I think that's enormously powerful, but also, again, it edges into inevitability, and it becomes hard to see the kind of contingency and the messiness of how neoliberalism has evolved and where we are today. So I want to pay attention to the messiness instead, and just put more emphasis on that, the things that didn't quite work out. But I'm saying when I'm doing that, I'm certainly not the only one who's become interested in this question recently. So we can look historically, the work of people like Krippner, Clift, but also I was thinking Tom and Liam, presented just last week at the Whippet, a conception of what's going on today, which was also speaking to this idea of saying we don't need to conceptualize this in a monolithic way. We can actually identify a whole range of contradictory, but still ultimately important patterns and dynamics. And I think there is this broader trend to try to understand the complexity and the messiness of neoliberalism in the past and in the present. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk, pretty straightforward, give you the very beginnings of a theory of economic ignorance. This is still a work in progress. And then use those ideas to look at the early Reagan and Thatcher years, okay? And to look at examples of what I see as being wishful thinking, a kind of cluelessness, confusion, a kind of muddling through, and denial, okay? So an initial set of categories, typology, very provisional. Then draw a few initial conclusions and finish off with a few more questions, because, as I will argue shortly, ignorance is okay. Ignorance is normal, and I am still profoundly ignorant, in fact, about a lot of these questions. Okay, so what is ignorance? How do we study it? It's kind of an odd duck to look at. And I want to argue, actually, one thing that's important is to think of, we might intuitively, on a gut level, think ignorance versus knowledge. But you don't have to dig very deep to realize that that's not the case. In fact, that ignorance is a part of knowledge. We always only know selectively. We can't know everything. God knows today, in a world of endless data, that's even more the case. But also, I think, if you think about it, it's also in some ways how language, how thinking actually operates. And I'm going to throw in an unexpected, probably, thinker in an IPE lecture, and because there's this great passage in an essay by Nietzsche on truth and lie in an extramoral sense, in which he reminds us that language itself actually functions by forgetting, ignoring. And he says, just think of a leaf, right? All leaves are fundamentally different. Every single leaf is different from every other leaf. And so by using the language and the word leaf, what we're doing fundamentally is forgetting. We're trying to forget the fact of those particularities and those differences. And that's actually functional. And he says not only is this, in fact, an essential part of language, but of social survival itself. And he gives this funny little anecdote. So imagine, if, in fact, we actually noticed the contingency, the dense particularities, the changeability of the world in its fullness, right, that we would actually fall into the same ditch every day. Because every day we would look at the ditch and we would see that, in fact, it changed, right? It was different. So we don't fall into the same ditch because we are always involved in a process of forgetting, of ignoring, of simplifying, so we can survive. Now, stepping back a little to maybe something a little closer to home, we can also think about, as our work as scholars, we're also familiar with ignorance. Ignorance is a fundamental part of knowledge production itself, right? It is generative of research. We start in research with a question, not with an answer. At least we're doing good research, right? We start with a question, a real question. And we start by saying, I don't know. There's all these things that I don't know, right? So that's central to the process of knowing. But ignorance is also a tricky kind of thing because it also reminds us of our limits. It can be destabilizing. It reminds us that what we know is always partial. whereas what we don't know is potentially limitless, right? There's always something else that we don't know and that can, in a sense, potentially get us into trouble. And though maybe that's why we feel somewhat uncomfortable about the concept of ignorance. Okay. Stepping back from, I don't know what we call that, a very brief, quick and dirty epistemology of ignorance, thinking a little more pragmatically, there's been an interesting literature out there on the role of ignorance in organizations. So we may tend to think of organizations, as using essentially expertise as sources of authority, right? Trust me, I know the best because, I'm an expert. I've worked on the IMF and the World Bank. That is their bread and butter, right? That's how they defend themselves. Governments do this all the time too. But in fact, there's a whole literature that reminds us that it can actually be quite useful for organizations not to know certain things. That ignorance can be functional. So why is it useful? Well, it can enable an organization to, again, drawing on some of the literature that's out there, for one thing, ignore facts that might force policy change. And so Lindsay McGooey has done a really interesting analysis here of how UK regulative agencies were willfully ignorant about the certain dangerous side effects of certain kinds of antidepressants, SSRIs. And she suggests that that was a way of them avoiding making some changes that, for various complicated reasons, they didn't want to pursue. We can also see how ignorance allows organizations, governments, among others, to fudge the numbers when there's some inconvenient facts that they don't want to admit. So Brian Rappert has looked at how the UK government kept citing methodological difficulties. Some of you may remember this, in producing reliable statistics on the deaths caused by the Iraq War. Sorry, that stuff is just too difficult. So we can't fully know that. Now, obviously, in all of this, that ignorance is allowing a kind of avoidance of responsibility, right? That's one of the useful things about ignorance. If you don't know it, you don't have to take the blame for it. But that particular image I have there, I don't know if you can see it, there's the Queen, right? This is a reminder of the fact that economists, of course, use the claim of ignorance in their answer to the Queen when she said, why didn't you see the financial crisis coming? And the answer was, it's too complex, systemic risk, our model, so on. Right, again, it was partly about saying, sorry, but, we didn't quite know, we didn't expect it, so we're not fundamentally responsible. Okay, so it can be useful to be, ignorance is in some ways fundamental, it is also potentially useful, but what about economic ignorance? What does it mean to think about economic ignorance? Because it might actually seem perverse to talk about economic ignorance, right? When we think about economics, we think about perfect information, efficient markets. We think about all prices as a form of information. All of these are basically pointing to the importance of knowledge, of information, and the absence of ignorance. It's a solution to the problem of ignorance. Or is it? Because in fact, as a number of scholars like Matt Davies, Melinda Cooper, and others have pointed out, ignorance plays a much more complicated, kind of paradoxical role in mainstream, particularly in neoliberal economic theory. So they draw in particular, and they look at Friedrich Hayek, although you can see the same discussions, much more explicitly political, taking place, for example, in the debates within the Institute for Economic Affairs around the sort of 70s and early 80s. And this is their basic sense is that's, in fact, you want the state to remain ignorant. Like, a certain amount of ignorance is essential. In particular, you want the state to remain ignorant of certain things, not only because ultimately the market knows best, but also because it is dangerous. So not only because the state can't know everything, but because the state shouldn't know too much, because that would be an imposition, a danger to freedom, right? The sort of notion that fundamentally there needs to be a lack of knowledge, a lack of information in that particular sense. So there's an attempt here in some ways to define the boundaries of legitimate knowledge, to what can be known, but also what we should remain ignorant about on a sort of moral basis. So economics has a kind of complicated relationship with ignorance. But I think it's also important to point out that the role, ignorance actually in that sense plays a profoundly political role, okay? So we often talk about how expertise is depoliticizing. I've done that, right? If you treat something as technical, as expert, then suddenly you take it out of the realm of political conversation and debate. But I think it's worth remembering that ignorance is also profoundly depoliticizing in certain ways, because it allows us to forget, to say it's okay to forget certain uncomfortable things. We can remain ignorant of those things. We don't have to talk about those deaths or those suicides, for example, with the SRIs or whatever, right? There are things, problems of inequality, that doesn't quite fit in my model, right? The sense in which there are things that we're able to not pay attention to through a logic of ignorance. So there's a politics there too. As I'll talk about, that politics plays out in very interesting ways in the sort of theory and practice of the early 1980s. And finally, I want to sort of, I think this is where I'm heading. I'm going to make this as an initial sort of thesis. That the more I think about this, the more I realize that in fact, ignorance plays a foundational role in many ways in political economy, in our conception of political economy, in that all economic ideas and all of the practices that seek to mobilize those ideas ultimately contain a theory of ignorance, key assumptions about ignorance. Okay, that they have in them a sense of where ignorance lies, where it doesn't lie, what we need to pay, what we can know, what we can't know, what we have to know, what we don't have to know. And those are all in some profound way a conception of where ignorance and the role of ignorance. Okay, and I will unpack that a bit more and talk about how that plays out in particular in some of the early theories, in particular rational expectations theory, which was very important, I'm going to argue, in this early period, although it remains with us today, which is quite interesting. Okay, so very quick and dirty. I know I threw a lot at you. Let's unpack it in practice and see what this looks like when we look at the sort of debates that were going on at this time. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the early Reagan and Thatcher years. And I said my focus now is going to be on the late 70s and early 80s. So as Reagan and Thatcher first took power and really did try to make some profound changes in how people thought, but also how economic policy worked. So the problems, and this is as they define them, right? So the problems, just a reminder, what were they facing at the time? On the one hand, they were facing stagflation. So they were facing the combination of high inflation, which had been on a sort of recurrent basis, been with them for at least 15, maybe almost 20 years back, over and over again. But now combined also with low growth, stagnation, high unemployment, a major problem. This is something everyone could agree on. What the new right also saw at the same time as a problem was they also, and this is very clear in the again, Friedman didn't think unions were a problem. Hayek did, IEA did, and so on. There are certain differences of opinion here, but broadly there was also a belief that one of the profound problems here was the size of government, the power of government bureaucracy, and the power of unions. So you had to come up with a solution to stagflation and inflation that didn't rely too much on government and didn't rely too much on negotiating with unions, which is what had been, that's what incomes policy and wage controls and so on had done before. Okay, so a problem and also another set of problems from their perspective that was going to dictate the nature and the shape of the solution. So what did they come up with? Again, quickly on theory, you got Friedman, Arthur Laffer, right? You have monetarism, right? Friedmanite monetarism, this basic idea that you could control inflation ultimately, not through complicated negotiations, not through demand management, but fundamentally by setting a target for the money supply, controlling the money supply. Very sort of seemingly simple apolitical set of strategy. Of course, very painful in the end, but that was the idea. You ask anyone who was having, I think my mother was paying 21% on her mortgage at one point. Anyway, but it looked like a good idea at the time. Supply side economics, this is where we get our friend Arthur Laffer here, right? And the theory here was that, but you could cut taxes, particularly to the rich, but that you could actually end up, because the growth would be so dramatically stimulated by cutting red tape, that you would actually end up without increasing the deficit magically, because ultimately you would have higher government receipts from that much more dynamic economy. Okay, so again, two sort of wonderful magical solutions. And finally, rational expectations theory, which I'm going to talk about in more detail, which I'm going to argue is kind of the key to making the other two work. It's kind of the linchpin that has, I think, generally not been as appreciated as I think it needs to be. Okay, so lots of powerful ideas and expertise. These guys were advising government, flying across to the UK and giving presentations. They were sitting there, they were advising Reagan directly. A lot of expertise out there. Do we find ignorance? And if so, what does it look like? So as I was saying, I think one of the most important economic ideas at this early period was rational expectations. So what am I talking about? What is rational expectations theory? I'm going to try to give a quick version. So John Muth in 1961 published an important paper in which he presented the idea of rational expectations, which has come to be widely accepted in mainstream economics. So what he developed was a critique of Keynes. So if anyone has any familiar with Keynes, Keynesian theory focuses on aggregates, right? Inflation, unemployment, growth, like these broad social aggregates. And his critique is very much like Thatcher, right, coming in and saying there's no such thing as society. So this is the same idea. There's no such thing as these social aggregates. Everything fundamentally in the economy has to be explainable in terms of micro foundations, in terms of the rational behavior of individuals. Okay, that is how everything has to come back to that. That's what we need to do. And when you do that, individual expectations, in fact, become key. You have to look at what do people think, they're rational, but what are they expecting? Because those expectations have this profound impact in the economy. And he argued that individual expectations, in the past, like Keynes had this notion that they were adaptive, that they were backward-looking. There were all these different theories of expectations. He said, no, they're rational. That is, and they're self-interested, okay? They are correct, and they are instantaneous, right? They adapt, they update very rapidly. Now, when he assumes that they're correct, it's not because he's saying everyone, has a perfect model of the economy in their head. But in a sense, that's what ends up happening. And the argument is that it's stupid to be wrong. It's expensive to be stupid in a sense, or it's expensive to be wrong. That because of in a market, if you are constantly wrong with your model of the economy, you're ultimately going to, end up in serious trouble. And so through the logic of the market over time, people will develop an accurate sense of the economy. And therefore, we can presume that because it's irrational to be, losing money all the time, that people ultimately come to understand the economy. Okay. So we have a rational, what matters here is we have a rational idea of expectations as rational. Now then, 1976, Robert Lucas comes in with his Lucas critique. And essentially what he does is he takes the assumptions in rational expectations theory and he weaponizes them, okay? And what he says is, and he gets the Nobel Prize for this, right? But he basically says that because of rational expectations, pretty much any government intervention in the economy is doomed. Okay. Why are government interventions doomed? They're doomed because individuals are going to adapt rationally and instantaneously. So a government that wants to, say, stimulate the economy, inflate the economy, give people a tax cut, people will say, I got a tax credit. Oh, just a second, this is going to be inflationary. So I'm not going to spend the money, I'm going to put it in the bank. And guess what happens then? It doesn't work, right? Because people don't spend the money and that tax cut is not stimulative. So there is just no point. It's like, go home. Don't bother. No fine-tuning. Just give up, right? That's the lot. Intensely conservative political implications of this set of highly technical economic theories. So the implications then are, again, later theorists fine-tune this in various ways. So you have a series of papers building on each other, but we end up in a place where the argument is the best policy. You can't have a world with no government, so what do you have? You have a government that basically establishes simple rules, announces a target, sticks to that target, and that, today it's inflation targeting. Back then it was trying to target the money supply. But that's the best you can do. And that as I'll argue, as we'll see, actually it's supposed to work brilliantly, actually. It's sort of minimalist, but also enormously effective in theory. Okay, so that's the theory. What about in policy? Does this actually, because I'm interested not in the ideas of the abstract, but what did they do? What did they enable? How were they picked up? So I would argue that these were in fact really important in early new right economic policies. Okay, now who believed in it? Not everyone, that's for sure. Okay, there were internal debates. If you want to look in the US, there were quite a few Republicans who said this was voodoo economics and who pushed back. As I will give some examples of in the UK, you had pushback from Treasury, within Treasury as well. So it was not universally accepted, but there were still enough key figures in both Thatcher and Reagan governments broadly supportive of this idea, that it became an important dynamic, a kind of important justification for how these ideas would work. So what was the theory supposed to do then when they were kind of putting it into practice? It was supposed to be the motor in some ways that made monetarism and supply-side economics work. So what do I mean by that? The logic here was that there were going to be these dramatic moves. You're going to suddenly cut taxes. You're going to suddenly switch to monetarism. You're going to declare some targets, right? Big, bold moves. Volcker is very explicit about this, that this is partly about presentation. It's about a dramatic kind of moment, intervention. That it's going to dramatically shift expectations. Okay. Now, and the idea was what that would do is reduce inflation without the pain of a recession. And now how is it going to do that? The idea is that individuals, workers, see this, right? They go, oh my goodness, and businesses, they see this. They think this government is credible. They mean business, right? They're actually going to be changing the economy in a significant way. They've announced this particular monetary target, and that means my inflation is not going to be, 17%. It's going to be 5%. And so instead of asking for an, 20% wage increase, I only have to ask for 7%. And by doing that, of course, I don't price myself out of a job. You end up with much less unemployment, and you end up with a much less painful adjustment to a low inflation reality. That's the promise. That's the magic that is being promised, is through this, because of these instantaneous shifts in expectations, you can end up with a sort of gentler move away from inflation. Okay. So if we look at what's going on in this theory of rational expectations, there's actually kind of a politics and a theory of ignorance in play. So this is a theory of the distribution of ignorance, right? The individual economic actor has full knowledge, is rational, knows what's going on, but therefore the state is necessarily ignorant. So it's a theory of who has ignorance and who doesn't, with very important political implications, of course. But the other interesting thing that's going on here is this is a theory that only works through its own ignorance. This is why I'm arguing that the two ways in which I think ignorance is foundational to political economic theories, right? What do I mean by that? That this is a theory that only partially recognizes the social dynamics of the economy. So the Lucas critique is kind of brilliant in a way, right? It says, before the idea was government would do things and that would be the case. And he's like, no, it goes beyond. The government will take actions and rational individuals are going to respond, right? So it is a kind of partial, very thin conception of the social nature of the economy in which people respond, and their responses changes economic policy, changes the effectiveness of that policy. But it's only partially social. There's a whole world of much more complicated social dynamics. I'll talk about, as they, for example, as we'll see in the early 80s, they not only introduced monetarism and tried to control the money supply, but they also, deregulated finance. And it turns out those two actions had profound consequences interacted. And they couldn't see that because they only wanted to look at this very limited strategic conception of the social nature of economic policies. So they can see some of it and they can't see others. They can identify, for example, the fact that government can fail, but they can't see market failure anymore. Because if you recognize both market failure and government failure, you would have a much more historical, nuanced, complex, shifting conception of how the economy actually works, which of course they don't want to do. Okay. The other important point, of course, and if you can see this, what the promise was, is that this is a theory that allows them to ignore the political costs of the policy, that the potential costs of unemployment, misery, and so on, right, which everyone said was going to be part of the effects of trying to lower inflation, gets to be ignored and pushed out of the picture because you have this bright and shiny idea of how you get from here to there, how you end up deflating the economy without a lot of pain. Okay, so I would argue then that what we see here is a kind of form of ignorance as wishful thinking. And to move from that rather abstract into something that's maybe a little more concrete, for a sense of the logic of that kind of optimism and rational expectations, there's a quote by David Stockman, which I think is brilliant. And he was Reagan's first budget director. Okay, so he argues here, he's explaining the logic. He says, the inflation premium melts away like the morning mist. It could be cut in half in a very short period of time if the policy is credible. That sets off adjustments and changes in the perception that cascade through the economy. You have a bull market in '81 after April of historic proportions. Okay, so this is his prediction. This is how it's going to work, right? You're going to end up with, of course, you end up with a recession, but no, this is you end up with a bull market, right? You end up with this massive shift. And this is actually it's an amazing article that is available still and worth reading in The Atlantic, where they followed him, this first budget director, for almost a year, and interviewed him throughout the process. And he talks about how he thinks this is going to work. And it's called The Education of David Stockman. And I think when this piece was published, it actually cost him his job, as you'll see why. But that things don't quite work out as planned. So there's this amazing idea, right, that monetarism plus tax cuts and these radical shifts in expectations are going to catapult the economy into this new equilibrium, right, painlessly. This is the idea. But of course, in practice, it doesn't work. And as it's not working, a lot of confusion emerges. Okay, so here we've got David Stockman a little while later talking about budgets. None of us really understands what's going on with all these numbers. Okay, same article, he's saying, we have numbers, the Democrats have numbers, none of us actually knows what's going on. And I'm not going to talk about it now, but there's a fascinating set of documents that show how actually fudged those numbers were, because Greenspan and Wienerbaum and Stockman, they couldn't actually agree on what the economy was going to do when you did this. And so they had to kind of fudge the numbers. And of course, the markets then were like, you fudged the numbers. So again, like they couldn't figure out where, this is a new world, and they couldn't figure out how the numbers are going to work. Okay, so the result then is a series of forms of cluelessness and confusion. Okay, I'm going to just talk about 2 examples here. First, how do we control the money supply? So this was obviously the logic was based on the idea that you control the money supply. This is what the logic in the UK, the US, and Canada too, which in fact was one of the first countries to adopt monetarism. Friedman patted us on the back, we were very good. What were the problems? Well, they were finding it very difficult in the UK to control M3 and the US to control M1, right? So these monetary aggregates they were trying to control. They were much more difficult to control than they had expected. And as a result, for example, in the UK, you had this, as I'm going to talk about, the medium-term financial strategy, where there was the public, they published these targets, and by meeting the targets, that was supposed to increase the credibility of the government. And then, and it was this wonderful self-reinforcing thing. You publish the target, you make it. You publish the next target, you make it. But they kept missing the targets. They were not able to make the targets, right? And so the policy became increasingly incredible over time. This was not working. And what's very interesting is, as you see as this is happening, the increasing confusion going on within the government. So for example, you've got sort of emerging tension emerges. So Beryl Sprinkle here is the Undersecretary of Monetary Affairs in the first Reagan government and a former Milton Friedman student, a true believer in monetarism. And of course we have Paul Volcker, the Federal Reserve Chairman at the time. And Sprinkle, in particular, in the Fed, they're trying to understand what's going on, and they don't know. And their response is simply to blame Volcker and say, oh, it must be these technical problems. Volcker's getting this wrong. Volcker's getting that wrong. They're very much not wanting to admit the fact that the velocity of money which is actually one of the things that's changing. The speed of money moving through the economy is changing. They don't want to admit that. When they do admit that, they want to assume that it's temporary. And you have all these debates going on about what is happening and why, which also, again, translates into this blaming game. Right? Okay, it's their fault, it's not ours. We didn't get the policy wrong. Ironically, this is partly due, if you look at why ultimately was it so hard to control these monetary aggregates? Well, it's partly because at the same time as they were trying to control them, they were deregulating. So, in the UK, you had the end of exchange controls, you have the deregulation of the financial system, and so suddenly, it's okay for banks to pay people interest when they put their money into checking accounts. And the ways in which these aggregates were calculated was partly based on a set of divisions between checking and savings. Like suddenly people are changing their behaviors because the incentives have changed. But again, they can't initially see this as a possibility because they've defined the terms of the sort of social nature of the economy so narrowly, and they can't initially understand what they are convinced that some of these relationships between these variables are fixed, are timeless, are universal, rather than seeing them as historical and social. Okay. So second example of cluelessness. Why is the US deficit inflationary? This may seem like a weird thing to be confused about, but if you think about it, so in some ways it's not rocket science, right? Why was there a big US deficit? They promised no deficit, right? They promised massive growth. They promised lots of things. But you've got Reagan massively increases military spending, right? You've got tax cuts, and you've got a recession. You put those together, you get a deficit, okay? Where the confusion comes in, first confusion, tax cuts weren't supposed to increase the deficit. That was the theory, at least, right? With supply-side economics, the Laffer curve. So that's one source of confusion. But the more profound one, in a sense, is the idea that Friedman, Sprinkle, the supply-siders all argued deficits were not supposed to be inflationary. Their argument was that, anyway, as long as you don't monetize the deficit, it's technical. But they were convinced that deficits were not going to be inflationary. This should not pose a problem. But, of course, it did. And so you end up with these massive major internal debates going on as these key figures like Greenspan, we've got Friedman there, and Burns, Arthur Burns, former Federal Reserve Chairman, all debating, trying to understand what is actually going on. And so there's amazing minutes actually from this meeting in March of 1982 of the President's Economic Policy Advisory Board. All these guys and others are sitting on it, and they're sitting around. They're major economists trying to figure out, like, why is the deficit inflationary? And obviously it's causing problems. This isn't just technical, this is political. Like the size of the deficit means basically, like they had promised in their projections a very small, almost non-existent deficit. instead, the projections are massive for deficits, and that means that Republicans, basically, who were supporting the tax cuts, are now not going to be supporting them anymore. That's their fear. So again, they're sitting around, they're trying to figure out what's going on and why in that moment, the moment of intense confusion and debate, and a certain amount of blaming. Okay. So in the face of all these unknowns, policymakers often have to what? Muddle through, right? They fudge, they figure it out, they act in spite of not knowing. That is often very much the case. So again, I want to look at two examples where we see this kind of muddling through occurring in this time. The first, the medium-term financial strategy. So in the UK, this was one of the key means of putting monetarism and rational expectations into practice. So you establish this financial strategy, which declares a set of targets for the money supply and a target for public borrowing. Again, in the belief that that would help people change their expectations, move inflation downwards. But again, even as this was being debated and decided, there were major internal debates and uncertainties about what was actually going on and why. And so Sir Douglas Wass, for example, who's the Treasury Permanent Secretary, so senior public servant at the time, says, you have profoundly contradictory goals going on in what you're talking about here. You cannot have lower inflation without also either cutting spending, keeping tax rates up, or accepting very high interest rates. You can't have your cake and eat it too, he's basically arguing. Of course, the response is, oh, yes, we can, because of rational expectations. And his response here is that, that these assumptions that you can have all these things are implausible to the point of incredibility. Okay, like he's highly skeptical of that set of arguments. And yet, in the end, he doesn't win the day on this. He actually argues against having a single, quantitative targets at all, because he thinks that, if you miss them, you're in trouble. And of course, he was right. So the solutions, again, as you see in the memos here, is, well, let's temporary presentational fudges. We can fudge the way we represent the numbers. We can change, we can basically create ways so that the inconsistencies are less obvious and try to reduce the embarrassments. Didn't actually work, but that was the attempt. You muddle through. You don't necessarily know it. You do your best. You muddle through. You fudge. But I think perhaps the most obvious example of this kind of muddling through, or of this kind of fudging, is what became known as the magic asterisk in the UK. Okay, so the first Reagan budget in 1981, you've got Stockman and the Senate Budget Committee are basically, trying to show a balanced budget in the future. They say, this is what we're going to do, and this is how by 1984-ish, right, by the time Reagan goes up for re-election, we're going to have a balanced budget. But they did it through this magical asterisk. And the little asterisk then said, well, that is based on future spending cuts, which are to be determined by President Reagan and accept in the future. So we show a balanced budget. We put a little asterisk, right, that all this, that all hinges on a series of spending cuts that no one has actually agreed on, but which we will figure out in due course. And in the process, they could ignore their other data suggested if those cuts didn't happen, you're going to have at least a 60 billion plus deficit, which was very significant at the time. But that could be basically ultimately fudged by putting in this magic asterisk and made it possible ultimately to get the budget through Congress. And worked for a while, except of course, until it didn't, because there was a major deficit, which caused problems. Okay. So as we see, right, there was a series of attempts to develop ideas, a set of techniques that were going to put them into place, and then a series ultimately of interesting forms of ignorance, of this kind of magical thinking, wishful thinking, of various kinds of cluelessness, confusion, and muddling through. And the results of all this, obviously, are a number of major failures and success. So what are the failures, right? Monetarism. Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve gives up in 1982. The medium-term financial statement in the UK disappears a few years later. Canada also gave up on monetarism in 82, although the governor of the Bank of Canada argued that they didn't give up on monetarism. Monetarism gave up on them. That basically, it became impossible to do this anymore. It just didn't work. Okay. Supply-side economics, a huge deficit in spite of the promises. I mean, you could argue, of course, it worked in a different way. It started, creating the conditions of inequality we have today. But certainly in terms of what it said it was going to do, did not work. And rational expectations. Again, a lot of internal memos at times saying, well, actually, it looks like markets' expectations are not that rational. There's a lag. They're not, in fact, shifting their expectations the way we thought they would. But again, that gets forgotten later on. But how did they succeed? Because if we look back at the early Reagan and Thatcher years, we don't see failures, right? What we remember is, well, they got inflation down, and then eventually they got reelected, right? So how did they succeed? Well, they succeeded the old-fashioned way, right? Through major recession, unemployment, this is what happens to UK unemployment in the 80s, and misery, and then eventually also by beating up the unions. Right, that's how they worked. There was no magic. There was no wishful thinking. There was nothing technocratic or apolitical, right? Old-fashioned politics actually rears its head and is in fact very effective at the time. So that's how they succeeded. And yet, how does it get narrated? Very differently. Like, how do they respond to the fact that their actual ideas, their plan failed? Well, largely it's denial, okay? So again, we can look at, the classic examples here of Sprinkle and Friedman in different ways. Sprinkle in his speeches, Friedman in a lot of his public intellectual writings, basically says it wasn't a true test, And this is partly about, blaming Volcker and the Fed. The Federal Reserve didn't do it right. There were all these technical problems. We never really had monetarism, and so monetarism didn't actually fail. And there's actually a lot of effort at the time to just, speeches are all about why we're not failing. Okay, it wasn't a true test. We're just denying that problem. And that denial then also feeds into a kind of rebranding. We didn't fail, but what we have instead is, in the UK, political monetarism, right? We don't have technical monetarism, but the spirit, because Thatcher's brand was really linked to monetarism, right? So you couldn't just say we have political monetarism. We don't do it, but we still, think as if we did. New monetary consensus is what people often describe as the current sort of logic, dominant thinking about monetary politics, inflation targeting, and so on. But again, the assumption is there's a kind of linear path from one to the other, whereas that's actually not the case. Or my favorite, dynamically efficient tax cuts, right? Which is just another word for supply-side economics, right? Which is another word for massive wishful thinking. You can somehow have tax cuts and no deficit. Yeah, that's working in the US right now. And then that in turn, I think, allows for a kind of mythologizing, which I think is where we are today and what we saw for so long, which is because of that denial and rebranding, we can tell a story in which there is this kind of continuity, in which in fact, when in fact neoliberalism's ideas worked, and in fact not only did they work, but they're the only alternative, and that's where we are today, right? Because we saw the light, and they're the unfortunate truths that that's just the way the world is, and we have to suck it up, right? That's where we are today. Or not. So, some initial conclusions. And I know I've covered a lot of ground, thrown a lot of random ideas at you. But let's talk about what I think we see here. So I think it's useful to think in terms of varieties of ignorance. And again, my initial typology would be that we have, on the one hand, right, we have wishful or even magical thinking, right, which is willfully ignoring how ridiculous an idea is. This is the most extreme version, the Laffer curve. But there are many versions of that in there, right? You've got cluelessness, right, which is genuine confusion about what is going on once, the wishful thinking doesn't actually match reality. You have muddling through, right, which is doing what you can in spite of your cluelessness about what is actually going on. And finally, denial, which is blissfully ignoring all of the above when things go wrong and pretending that it's someone else's fault, which of course none of us ever do, right? Anyway, I know I'm being a little silly, but I think, in spite of the silliness of this, these are actually quite powerful tools, right? And they are tools that they're patterns that we see then, and I would argue maybe we see more widely, but we certainly see when we go back to this particular moment of extreme uncertainty, this very new set of ideas we're trying to put into place. So what are the roles? What is that? So that might be the varieties. Again, my second question: what are the roles? What does this mean? Does this matter or not? What does this do? And I think there is a politics to economic ignorance. I think we can think of ignorance in a number of different ways. That ignorance here is inevitable, right? At one level, that's kind of obvious, right? Of course, we can't know everything. Of course, policymakers are not gods, right? So it's always going to be a part of knowledge and a policy making. We should not be surprised. I don't know why I was surprised. Maybe it's not a puzzle. Okay, that's the start. But then ignorance is also strategic. And that's also, I think, very clear here. And I've got one last quote from Stockman from the same article, right? At the very end, he says, the supply-siders have gone too far. they created this non-political view of the economy where you are going to have big changes and abrupt turns and their happy vision of this world of growth and no inflation with no pain, right? So he ends up seeing his excessive optimism, and it's partly because like he's budget director, which means he actually has to get members of Congress to agree to cuts. They're all happy to do the tax cuts, but not the spending cuts, right? And he realizes this is massively political and it just doesn't work. Okay, but clearly that was very strategic, that kind of ignorance, right? It made things that were politically difficult, almost impossible, palatable. Maybe through a little bit of, denial, right? But again, it made certain kinds of coalitions possible, at least for a time. But beyond that, so it is beyond that, I think ignorance is actually really, you can see it as productive in political economy in a particular kind of way. That it's not just depoliticizing, making things palatable, making you not see the politics, but it's also about redrawing the boundaries of what counts as politically salient and significant, right? It's about telling you what you can ignore and what you can't, right? That there are some things you don't have to pay attention to that don't matter. So for example, obviously, the shift from seeing full employment as your primary priority to seeing inflation as your primary priority. It's about forgetting certain things, not paying attention to them, ignoring them, and deciding that they don't matter. There's a kind of normative politics here too, I think, and a kind of ontological, dare I say, politics about what you see in the world, what different theories postulate as existing as economic and as political in the world. And ultimately, though, so all of these kind of suggest, it's all entirely willful, it's all entirely intended. And I think, no, not at all. I think ignorance is also destabilizing. I think is useful about looking at us is it does allow us to see how imperfect and partial any form of expertise is. There is always a lot people don't know, right? And that shows, again, reminds us of how messy this is, how much friction there is as people try to translate their ideas into practice, how fragile those attempts are, how frequent failure actually is. So I think it's also useful in that sense, reminding us of that. Okay, I'm finishing off now. And I want to just finish off with some questions because, as I said, this is a work in progress. So I still have I'm still ignorant about a lot of things. And I want to throw out a few final questions that I think, which also I think show why this is an interesting research program. So my first is, really like what came before? So I want to ask, I've talked about neoliberalism here in its early forms, but how unique is neoliberalism in its reliance on ignorance? I would guess probably not very. But how unique in the particular form that it takes, I would guess that could actually be quite interesting, that different kinds of economic ideas are going to have built into them different kinds of assumptions about where the ignorance lies and what form it takes and what its politics are. Okay, so how does it compare with earlier forms, like Keynesian versions of economic ideas? Are there Keynesian forms of ignorance? Many people have argued Keynes was hugely naive, for example, in talking, and as he famously does at the end of the general theory, where he says, he thinks that the power of vested interests is greatly overstated in comparison with the power of ideas. Now, I think ideas are important too, but vested interests are also really important. So are there things that he is ignoring, in a sense, in order to put this vision of the world into place? I don't know, but I think that's worth unpacking. And more generally, what does this tell us about their conceptions of politics, right? Different, I think, conceptions of ignorance, different theories of ignorance, implicit theories of ignorance, are going to also tell us a bit about what these theories do and don't want to see. There's a real politics to, I think, again, that's why I say I think this is foundational to how we think about different conceptions of politics and economics and political economy. What came next and why? So these are the two directions I think I take my research, right? It is clear that wishful thinking didn't work in the 1980s. The failures were such, that at the end of the day, there was no bloodless decrease in the rate of inflation, right? It was ultimately very messy, visceral, and political. And this is an image from the victory to the miners. Again, a reminder of Thatcher's in her second term, her attack on the unions. This was not a bloodless process. But we're looking at it today. Wishful thinking did come to define the Great Moderation. This way of thinking, that's what central bank independence. This is the era of rational expectations, right? So the Great Moderation is sort of late 80s through to the recent financial crisis. I still call it recent because I'm old, right? Anyway, my students are all like, 2008. That's like a decade. Well, it's a decade. It's a century ago. Anyway, that was the era of rational expectations, right? Central bank independence, the inevitability of globalization, right? This is when that came into play. And all of that in many ways, right, was about, avoiding responsibility and saying, well, we would love to do things differently, but at the end of the day, it's not us who get to make this. It's the central banks that make this. We're ignorant about this stuff. They are knowledgeable. It's the markets, right? It's the global. These are we're externalizing responsibility through that, right? So my question is, why was this the third way and not the new right? I went back expecting the new right to be the ones putting this in place. And you see the ideas articulated there, but you see them institutionalized much later, a decade and a half later. Why? Right? Why? I don't know. I need to move into the 90s, okay? That's my center. Okay. And finally, where do we go from here? Which is kind of a question and it's somewhat rhetorical. So I would argue, right, that the costs of wishful thinking, were enormous, right? They allowed us to ignore the human costs of these economic policies, to not see them because they just didn't count. But they also gave us the 2008 global financial crisis because, again, a whole range of different risks were simply not visible, right? You're sort of highly unrealistic assumptions about how rational actors behave, and, oh, whoops, we missed that. Systemic risk, that's interesting. That kind of bit us in the butt, right? So how does that, that, again, a significant cost. The political costs also, I think, are perhaps, like, right after the crisis, 5 years after, we might have focused on that. But I think today, and I think SPERI in its rethink is also looking at this, that the political costs of this are also profound, right? And I would argue that, unfortunately, in some ways, this shift made democracy mean less. Like, why bother voting if politicians don't take responsibility? Colin Hay has written about this in other kinds of ways, right? So politicians tell you that they can only be ignorant about some of these questions, right? That the source of knowledge lies in the markets or it lies in the central banks. That at the end of the day, they're not taking responsibility, but they're also saying that, vote for me, but I can't make a difference. And so why are we so surprised when a Donald Trump or an extreme Brexiter comes along and says, I have the answers, I will give you back control. I will take back control and I will give that back to you. Now, unfortunately, of course, there's another kind of profound ignorance in play there. But at the end of the day, I think, this is a cost that is not unrelated to the ways in which we've conceptualized ignorance. So I would argue today we don't need more ignorance, obviously. But we do need to be more honest about the limits of our knowledge, okay? Yeah, I could put up a picture of Donald Trump, but I won't. I will resist that temptation. I think we need a more accurate history of past ignorance, right? Not this myth of the inevitable translation of neoliberal theory into practice, which I think has shackled us in many ways. But I also, sort of bringing it home, I think we need to acknowledge as scholars that we are all actually purveyors, not just of knowledge, but also of ignorance, right? And that some of that is absolutely necessary. That's what we do. We have to select. We can't know everything. But some of that is also dangerous. And of course, the challenge is figuring out the difference.